certainly a good way to start in that direction of learning more about democracy in general. Professor Huefner is on the faculty of the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, where he teaches a number of things, which I'll have to read because I don't have them memorized, and they're in very small print. Legislative clinic, legislation and um, regulation, election law, jurisprudence, law and religion, and legal writing. And an interesting thing about him is that he spent some time in Japan and it speaks Japanese and is interested in Japanese law. So, and he's also a graduate of Harvard College and the Columbia School of Law. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Alice. It's really a privilege for me to be with you, and I appreciate all that you and Elizabeth have done to organize the event and make it possible. And I look forward very much to being able to have some conversation and question and answer about things. And I liked the lead in and the way in which Alice described the effort here to use a discussion of the Electoral College to be able to also think just more generally about the health of our democracy. And before we get into some discussion and question and answer, I did think I'd try to make a few observations about the Electoral College in particular. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with a few slides to that effect. Let me just offer a little bit of a quick overview of the things I'd like to just briefly touch upon before we open it up for discussion. And I'm sure that this is going to resonate with most of you, but I mean, an opening observation is that the Electoral College mechanism by which we elect the president is just no longer justifiable, in my view. There are people who continue to argue in its behalf, but I find it hard to really agree with their underlying claims about why it still serves some appropriate purpose. At the same time, the Electoral College as the mechanism for electing our president is incredibly entrenched, locked in, and it makes reform quite difficult. Nonetheless, I do want to be able to talk today about, oops, my slides are misfiring a little bit. Yeah, well, we'll come back to the part of the slide that just disappeared so quickly. Says I've got 4 main options that I'd like us to at least identify and distinguish as possible reform proposals. But before we get into that, let me say a little bit more about some of the reasons in which it's really no longer justifiable. So you're probably familiar with the data that's in this slide. If you think about what it's saying here, it's pointing out that over the course of the country's history, there have been 5 times when the candidate who won the presidency through the operation of the Electoral College did not actually win the popular vote. That's not that many across the country's history, but if you look carefully at these data, you'll see that 2 of those 5 times were in the last 2 decades, right? And so we're now familiar with the fact that it happened both in 2000 and in 2016. And that in fact, in 2004, it came pretty close. That had in fact some, 70,000 votes in Ohio gone the other way to flip the result of the state of Ohio so that John Kerry would have won Ohio and thereby won the Electoral College, he would have won the presidency even though he lost the popular vote. Now, in addition to the fact that it's happened twice now in the last 2 decades is just the underlying extent to which the mechanism of the Electoral College means that the popular vote total doesn't matter. And that is increasingly uncomfortable for us to reckon with, to realize that we have a system that doesn't recognize a popular vote winner, and the way in which that then distorts the campaigns and the way in which candidates focus their attention on the battleground states and so on. And I'm not going to belabor the ways in which the Electoral College has really outserved its historical purpose. Let me instead just go ahead and make a few more observations about the next observation I had. And here too, I'm sorry to say my slides are misfiring. That second bullet point was an attempt to say that it's incredibly entrenched again. And it's incredibly entrenched essentially because it is simply so hard to amend the US Constitution. Amending the US Constitution requires first a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, unless we use an alternative mechanism by which 2/3 of the states can ask Congress to organize a constitutional convention. But the amendments that we've adopted so far in the country's history have come through the first mechanism, in which 2/3 of both houses of Congress themselves agree to put a particular amendment proposal before all the 50 states. Well, today, all the 50 states. And once 2/3 of both houses of Congress agree to propose an amendment, it then has to be ratified in 3/4 of the states, which today is 38 states. And that's a very steep hill to climb. And with respect to the Electoral College process itself, although there have been hundreds of proposed amendments to the Electoral College introduced in Congress, they do not get very far. The most promising effort to amend the Electoral College process occurred in 1971. And that year, the proposal to do away with the Electoral College and replace it with a popular vote actually passed the House of Representatives by a 2/3 vote, but it then died in the Senate. And we just have never come close since then, even though I think almost every Congress, somebody is introducing a proposal to do away with the Electoral College. Well, so it's no longer justifiable, yet incredibly entrenched. What are the reform options that are available to us? So I said I'd like to just briefly identify 4 options that we have. It's really 3 options, I guess. One would be to continue to work as aggressively as we could to abolish the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment. Another would be to work on an interesting reform proposal that has been underway now for about 15 years that goes by the name of a National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. But I also today want to spend a little time talking about the possibility of encouraging states, as a matter of individual state choice, to return to something that is a more majoritarian model of implementing the Electoral College, or a more majoritarian model of deploying the Electoral College. Sometimes it is being described as a Jeffersonian model. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the 4th option then is really to do nothing. And there again, my last bullet on the slide just is not staying put. But the item number 4 there, the 4th option would be to do nothing, which maybe it's a little too glib to treat as an option. So the option of abolishing the Electoral College, as I said, is a repeated idea. It has been attempted many times. It is a very difficult process, but it's still something that people are actively working on. And I did want to just note that in recent years, one of the more prominent efforts to encourage us to think seriously about abolishing the Electoral College has been encouraged by Jesse Wegman, who was a member of the New York Times editorial board. And a year ago, he published a book that he'd been working on for a while about abolishing the Electoral College. And so I've just gone ahead and put the cover image of his book on the screen as a point of reference. And it does a nice job of collecting some of the history of the Electoral College and some of the underlying reasons that explain how we got the Electoral College, but then talking about the way in which it today really doesn't serve us well at all. Jesse Wegman's book also talks a little bit about alternatives to trying to abolish the Electoral College simply because amending the Constitution is so hard. And the principal alternative that he discusses is this notion of a national popular vote that could be effectuated without actually amending the Constitution. But I want to introduce here the organization that is behind it. And it is an organization you can find on the web. I'll put the URL for its homepage here on the screen. It is just www.nationalpopularvote.com. And they, on their webpage, have an incredibly rich set of resources. And many of you, I presume, are already quite familiar with this webpage and with this organization. But what the National Popular Vote organization is hoping to do is to create an interstate compact by which states would agree that they would award their electors to the candidate who has achieved who has won, let me say, the national popular vote. Now, I paused there for a minute in how I articulated the notion that this candidate would be the candidate who won the national popular vote, because it's not necessarily clear that I can say that the national popular vote plan would involve an agreement of states to award their electors to the candidate who'd won the majority of the national popular vote. And this is an issue that we need to wrestle with. We have with some frequency seen third-party candidates that mean there is no one candidate who has achieved a majority of the popular support. And that's a question we need to keep thinking about. But setting that aside for a minute, again, the national popular vote notion is you get enough states with enough votes to agree to this, then you don't need to amend the Constitution. Now, we may come back to the National Popular Vote plan and talk a little bit more about it. But let me first put the third reform proposal on the table. And this one is more complicated in certain ways. I mean, it's more involved for me to explain. But on the other hand, it is actually much more feasible or achievable in terms of the legal change that would have to occur for it to be a feasible alternative. I'll introduce it by identifying another book. This is a book that my colleague at the Ohio State University College of Law, Ned Foley, authored also about a year ago. And his book is an interesting historical unpacking of particularly the history of the 12th Amendment, which is, in fact, the amendment that now structures our electoral college process, and the way in which it has played out since the 12th Amendment was adopted in 1804, and the way in which it worked in the early years and the ways in which it has misfired more recently because of the fact that it does not today operate on a premise that would require states to award their electors on the basis of majority winners in the state. Now, I'm going to have to talk about this a little bit more, but before I do that, let me also just mention one more kind of fun point of connection between the idea of abolishing the Electoral College entirely, or perhaps adopting a national popular vote compact on the one hand, versus instead trying to take the Electoral College we now have and get states to use it in a more majoritarian fashion. About a year ago, our election law project at Ohio State hosted a discussion between Ned Foley and Jesse Wegman, each at that point talking about their new books. Now, this was just at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were all just learning how to do things on Zoom and Zoom webinars and so forth. But it was kind of a fun discussion, and I just want to let you know it's there. You can find it at this YouTube address, and I suppose if I tried really quickly here, I could see if I can cut and paste it. Whoops, I was going to try and put it in the chat. I'll let that happen later rather than test my technical skills at the moment. But it's about an hour and 15-minute discussion, I suppose, of their books, back and forth between the two of them. I was the moderator, as it happens. But that's another forum you could explore if you would like additional perspectives on these issues that we're talking about tonight. Now, I do want to say a little bit more about the underlying constitutional text that is relevant to thinking about how the Electoral College works and what reform possibilities are possible. Article 2 of the Constitution, which was partially superseded by the 12th Amendment, but only partially superseded, continues to provide in the opening portion of this article that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. And this is still, the sort of fundamental structure of our Electoral College. So each state gets the number of electors that's equivalent to its congressional delegation, and it's up to each state legislature to decide how each state picks those electors. Today, every state has chosen to conduct a popular election in its state to determine who will get the presidential electors from that state. That's not constitutionally required that we have a popular election. And in fact, in the early days, state legislatures were themselves directly appointing their state's presidential electors. You may have paid attention to some of the skirmishing around the 2020 election last fall, and have observed in that skirmishing, there was occasional discussion about whether a particular state's legislature should reclaim its authority to appoint electors in whatever manner it wanted, and even potentially claiming the authority to essentially ignore its popular vote. Now, that's a complicated issue, and I don't necessarily want to get us into that. It's a tangent to our discussion today. But it's important to know that legislatures get to decide how to appoint their electors. This provision was something that the original Constitutional Convention didn't give much thought to. And they assumed, in fact, that most state legislatures were going to make the appointment of their electors directly, rather than turn it over to a popular election. The 12th Amendment was adopted, as I said earlier, in 1804, not long after, and it did not change this dimension of the Electoral College process. But there have been 4 presidential elections by the time of the 12th Amendment, and in those 4 presidential elections, although many state legislatures were doing what the founders had anticipated and appointing electors directly, there were some variations. And all of these variations were consistent with the view or the idea that a given state's presidential electors should in some fashion be reflecting what the state's voters' majority view was about who the best president would be, and that the role of those electors in then casting a vote for presidential candidates was to be representative of the dominant view of their state. And that's pretty clear if you look at the discussions about how these processes would work and discussions in given states as they were deciding whether to appoint their electors directly through the legislature or to hold a popular election. I'm not going to go through this slide in much detail, but these are those 4 elections, and you can see that the slide provides a little more specificity about what was happening in each of the states in each of these 4 elections in terms of the manner of appointing presidential electors. And it was still true that most states, even after the 4 elections had occurred, 4 presidential elections, were appointing their presidential electors through their legislature rather than through popular election. But states were trying popular elections, exploring it, and some states were doing it using a districting process in which the total vote in the state didn't mean that some particular candidate got all of that state's electors. Instead, electors would be awarded based on dividing the state up into electoral districts. Now, all of this was representative or emblematic of the notion that the Electoral College was designed to try to produce a majoritarian winner. It had an anti-factional goal. And in the original Constitutional Convention, there were people voicing that kind of concern or that kind of aspiration for the Electoral College. And that the system that emerged, although it was somewhat complex, was designed to be more majoritarian. Now, it's also true that in the Constitutional Convention, the founders did not give much attention to the Electoral College, but it represented a kind of compromise between the notion that the Congress itself might elect the president in a way that would be akin to a parliamentary system's choice of the prime minister, on the one hand, versus an alternative that said the president should be popularly elected. And the framers developed the Electoral College as a way of having the president chosen through these state representatives that would be closer to the people and therefore more like a popular election, but that would still be mediating it a little bit and still be building on the fundamentally federal system that the framers were creating. But there was some complexity in that. And of course, at the time that the first, I'm going a little too, I'm trying to keep moving a little bit here. But at the time that this was being first deployed, there was a real hope that states would pick as electors people who would then in turn be able to identify a consensus choice to serve as president. And this was long before parties became so dominant in our political system. Well, not long before, but it was before. The parties sprung up pretty quickly. But there was a real hope that by letting this Electoral College process work, we would find leaders who were widely embraced and respected. And that worked with the election of George Washington. He was, in fact, that sort of choice. But it didn't last beyond Washington. And by 1800, we had a real disaster. And you may know that the original Electoral College, as it was spelled out in Article 2 of the Constitution, provided that each elector in each state was to cast 2 votes. And the candidate who then got the most votes would be the president, and the candidate who got the second most votes would be the vice president. And therein arose the problem in 1800 which is, sort of treated a little bit too simplistically in the musical Hamilton, if you've seen it there. Burr and Jefferson tied. They tied because they were running mates. And their electors were casting a vote for each of them because they were running mates. There had been a hope that there might be support from, again, we didn't anticipate parties to exist the way that they had come into being even by 1800. There'd been a hope that you wouldn't have this clear partisan division, and that you would get people from all over the spectrum, if you will, casting votes, and that there would be one person with more votes than another. But Jefferson and Burr were tied, and yet at the same time, even though they'd been on the ticket together, representing the same party, they were political rivals. And given the tie, it fell to the House of Representatives under this complex system that the founders had designed to pick the president. And therein came into play the sort of tension that you see in Hamilton the musical between the two, that ultimately led to Jefferson being elected the president. But because of the intrigue that resulted and the real political tension there was a clear sense that the Electoral College needed to be reformed so that we weren't seeing electors casting two undifferentiated votes, one for, that instead of casting two undifferentiated votes, we would have them cast a vote for president and a vote for vice president. And that's what the 12th Amendment made clear. And that there would then be a person with the greatest number of votes having been cast as a candidate for president, who would be the president. Now, in the course of creating the 12th Amendment, the members of Congress who were proposing this amendment spent way more time talking about what they wanted the Electoral College to do than the framers of the original Constitution had spent. And we have much more information about what the framers of the 12th Amendment then expected the Electoral College to do. And what's clear from the debate over the 12th Amendment is that this was intended to be a majoritarian process where no one would become the president until they had achieved an absolute majority of the number of electors who were able to vote. And in turn, and perhaps more importantly than that each state they expected would be using a majoritarian process to pick their electors. So, I'm calling this the Jeffersonian vision of the Electoral College as embodied in the 12th Amendment. The framers of the 12th Amendment were realizing that it was just not possible to have a consensus choice anymore, in part maybe because Washington had been historically unique, but perhaps also, and more importantly, because of the way in which political parties had arisen. But that nonetheless, you could have somebody who was widely popular. And that was true of Jefferson. And in fact, at the time of the 12th Amendment, the Republican Party, Jefferson's party, had the power unilaterally to amend the Constitution. They controlled 2/3 of both the US House and the US Senate. But even though they had that political clout, if you will, the original Electoral College process meant there was a possibility of strategic voting by the Federalists opposed to the Republicans that would have prevented Jefferson from being reelected. People then realized that if we kept using the same process that had given rise to this tie in the 1800 election, that the Federalists could strategically vote in a way that would mean Jefferson didn't tie with his running mate, but came in second to his running mate if the Federalists cast some of their votes for the Republican alternative. So the Republicans decided they wanted to reform the process. And they wanted a federal majority, as I'm calling it, to prevail over the possibility of strategic voting by the minority. And by federal majority, I mean what I said before, that this was to be a majority of electoral college votes that was in turn, in a second sense, majoritarian because it was assembled from states in which the winning candidate had been favored by a majority of voters. Now, the key takeaway from all of this, without belaboring it, is the principle of majority rule was fundamental to the operation of the revised Electoral College. Notwithstanding that, it didn't work either. The same way that the original Article 2 Electoral College wasn't working very well by 1800, it wasn't too long before the Jeffersonian Electoral College, as embodied in the 12th Amendment, wasn't working. So I've got listed here in this table the years in which the candidate who won the Electoral College process won it by accumulating votes from at least some states where they received less than 50% of the vote in that state. So if you look at this chart, you can see the number of votes required, that's the minimum at the time of the election, the number of votes received, and then the column that says greater than 50% shows you how many votes each of those candidates received from a state that voted more than 50% for that candidate. And in every one of these particular elections, the winner did not receive the minimum number of electoral votes in states that voted more than 50% for that candidate. In other words, they had to rely on Electoral College votes from states that voted only by a plurality for them. And that is a misfiring, if you will, of the Jeffersonian Electoral College. It happened because of the rise of third-party candidates and a failure to have structured electoral mechanisms that would have required something like, say, a runoff election to generate a majority winner. We can see this more sort of perhaps relatably to look at what happened in the 2016 election. And in this election, in which Donald Trump ended up capturing 304 electoral votes, and of course he only needed 270, but 101 of Trump's 304 electoral votes in 2016 came from 6 states in which Trump did not win a majority of the votes in that state. Or another way of thinking of it is, although Trump won all of the electoral votes in these 6 states, and they're listed in this chart, a majority of voters in those states voted against him, if you will. And you can see how that was true, that he's barely ahead of Clinton in each of these 6 states, but he's still below 50%. And other candidates, primarily Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, have more than made up the difference here. And the question that raises is this such a misfiring of the Electoral College process because it allows the Electoral College itself to select a president, even if that person is opposed by a majority of voters in states that are responsible for giving that candidate the necessary electoral votes? I think that's a problem. And there's a way around it. And there's a way around it that is really easy. The way around it is, in some fashion or other, to create an election process that requires a majority in order to get a majority of the states, in order to take all of the electoral votes in the state. There are a number of variations on that. But the basic idea is no candidate should get all of a state's electoral votes without winning at least 50%. And there would be multiple ways for doing this. One is to have an actual runoff, like New Hampshire and Massachusetts were doing back at the time of the founding. Another would be to use instant runoff voting, which is increasingly being used in a number of places, not necessarily as frequently for the presidential electors as for other types of elections. A third option would be to use a districting plan, as was also being done widely at the time of the founding and is still done today, or is again done today in Maine and Nebraska, as I imagine that you're all aware of. Or you could do something that is proportional. It wouldn't need to be to use districts, but you could still award a given state's electoral votes based on the proportion of the votes cast in that state for varying candidates. Or you could use a conditional proportionality rule, which would allow one candidate to get all of the state's electoral votes if that candidate achieved a majority of the votes in that state. But if not a majority, then it would be a proportional award. There's yet another possibility called Condorcet voting, which is something that Nobel Prize winners Maskin and Sen have been advocating for. And it involves finding the candidate that does the best in head-to-head contests against all other candidates. That's a little more complicated. But the key thing about all of these options is that a state can do any one of these now. It's part of the power that a state legislature has to decide how to appoint its presidential electors. It does not require a constitutional amendment. It does not require some sort of complicated agreement with other states the way the National Popular Vote Compact does. States already have the power to adopt this kind of a fix, and it would return our existing electoral college system to its Jeffersonian or majoritarian foundation. Now, is that a perfect solution? No. I'd rather see us scrap the electoral college. But scrapping the electoral college takes a constitutional amendment. I just have a couple more slides. I went ahead and just pulled from the League of Women Voters of Maine this sample of a ranked choice ballot, which is a way of doing instant runoff voting. And Maine is doing that now in its elections. It's a relatively straightforward process once a little voter education is done. And of course, we would rely on groups just like yours to help educate voters if we were able to make a shift to something like ranked choice voting. And I think I will leave it there. I hope I've given you some things to think about, and I hope you'll be willing to ask me questions to help clarify things that I muddied or didn't make particularly clear in talking about all of that. So have at me. Let's see what else you're interested in exploring.
I think you have to turn the video.
If you want to unmute yourself when you're asking a question. I have one question to start with. You hear today that the Electoral College was set up to give advantage to the slave states. Is that an accurate thing to say?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, it's certainly, I think, historically fair to say the structure of Congress itself provided an advantage to states in which slavery was an institution. And that in turn, the Electoral College structure was built on top of the congressional structure.
Karen Rainey asks, is there a solution that you think would work in Ohio?
Well, so, the National Popular Vote Compact, which I didn't really explain in much detail, has, I think, 15 states and the District of Columbia on board now. And those 15 states and the District of Columbia are responsible for, I think it's 196 electoral votes. That's a way of saying the Popular Vote Compact or National Popular Vote Compact is not yet close enough for Ohio to join the compact in a way that would make the compact then successful. The compact only works once it's got enough states agreeing to use it that account for 270 electoral votes or more. So that's not an option for Ohio to do on its own. So what is left for Ohio to do? Well, there are any one of those things that I was saying near the end of my PowerPoint slides that a given state could do would be something Ohio could think about. And it could include the familiar approach that Maine and Nebraska have taken to award Ohio's electoral college votes based on districts. It also could include a state reform. I mean, this would require the state legislature in Ohio to do this, but that would say Ohio will only award all of its electoral votes to one person if that person has achieved 50% of the vote. And that if that candidate, or if no candidate has achieved 50%, then we will award our electors proportionately or in some sort of proportional basis. You'd have to create a little bit of a formula to figure out just what the proportional award of electoral votes would be. But Ohio could also choose instead to essentially force us as Ohio voters to come to a majority view. That is to say, we could be structuring our elections so that there is a runoff, so that if after the November election, there is no candidate with 50% plus one, that then we take the top two and figure out now who would get a majority between those top two. And there are a number of ways to do a runoff. One is to actually do an old-fashioned runoff, which means a whole nother election day. I don't think that's particularly desirable to have a whole nother election day, but you could use a kind of ranked choice ballot that gives rise to an instant runoff. And that's where a little bit of voter education would help the public be able to engage with that kind of instant runoff process. There are a number of places around the country that are beginning to move to ranked choice voting. Typically, they are trying it at more local levels first rather than in statewide elections, as presidential elector selections are statewide. But that's something that we could do. I just saw a chat pop in with, an observation that awarding presidential electors on the basis of districts then would raise the question of whether those districts have been gerrymandered. And, you're right that then becomes an issue, but it's less problematic than awarding winner take all to somebody who hasn't even achieved a majority of the statewide vote, which is what we do now. And you could award presidential electors simply proportionately, not by districts, to be clear. Those are quite different options.
What about the splitting the districts like Maine and Nebraska do? Would that have a fair result or not?
Well, so that's the version that would be better than what we do now, but that might still trouble us a little bit if the districts are heavily gerrymandered. Maine and Nebraska are not Ohio, right? So Ohio's got, at the moment, 16 congressional districts and 18 electoral votes. And, Maine and Nebraska have, I think, 3 members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators. So we're looking at 5 total electoral votes in those states, not 18. And the fact that the state's divided into only 3 districts instead of 16 means there's maybe less possibility for gerrymandering to be occurring in those states.
Mhm.
we get more gerrymandering in our state because we have to draw more districts, and it gives the map drawers more opportunities to do some manipulation.
Right. And that's going to be they're going to be redrawn this year, which is another thing.
If the data show up, right?
Yeah, the data show up, right? Right. Anyone else have a question or a comment?
I'd love to say a little more about the National Popular Vote Compact. I feel a little bad that I maybe gave it short shrift in the slides I'd put together.
Yeah, that would be great to have a more explanation of how that would work.
It's a really interesting idea. And as I said, it's been around for, I think, about 15 years. The idea here was, recognizing how high a hill it is to climb to get an amendment to the Constitution adopted. Could we find some other way of honoring the national popular vote without having to amend the Constitution? And so the National Popular Vote Plan attempts to do that by getting states to agree that they will award their state's electors not to the candidate that wins the popular vote in their state, but instead to the candidate that wins the national popular vote, even if that candidate didn't win in their state. So, what if you take a state like California, which at the present day is always skewing towards the Democratic candidate for president. They sign on to the National Popular Vote Plan. They are saying that even if their state again votes for a Democratic candidate in 2024, California is not going to award its 50 some odd electoral votes to the Democratic candidate if the Republican candidate has more total votes across the nation, and that California will award its electoral votes to the Republican candidate if the Republican candidate wins the national popular vote. Now, that's a bold move. At the moment, as I said, there are 15 states that have committed to doing that on the condition that enough states agree to do it to amount to 270 votes. And until there are enough states to actually then determine the winner in the Electoral College, no state is obligated to cast its electoral votes for the national popular vote winner. Will we get to the point when we have enough states who've agreed to this, that by following through on the agreement, they would be casting 270 or more electoral college votes? Who knows? I mean, we're several states away, depending on how many more big states will sign on to the idea. But there have been some serious reservations raised about whether a national popular vote agreement or compact among states would work. There are some questions about whether it's constitutional for states to do this without complying with the provision of the US Constitution that provides when states enter into compacts with other states, Congress has to approve their compact. And if this particular mechanism is treated as that type of interstate compact requiring congressional approval, it's not at all clear that Congress would approve it. On the other hand, there are people who argue that it doesn't actually require that sort of congressional approval, that it's not that type of interstate compact, and that would be maybe precisely because Article 2 of the US Constitution gives the state legislatures of each state this very broad authority and discretion to decide how they want to award their electoral votes for the presidential election. And that if a given state's legislature has said, we want to award our state's electoral votes to the candidate who has won the national popular vote. It would be hard for Congress to assert they have to approve that agreement, is the sort of counter argument. On the third hand, if you will, on the one hand, on the other hand, and now on the third hand, there remains a really difficult problem about enforcement. What do we do in the event that we have enough states who have agreed to this compact that it is now operational, and yet after a November presidential election, before the meeting of the Electoral College in December, a particular state decides it doesn't like it anymore and it's not going to play? What sort of enforcement mechanism do we have? Concerns about compliance with the national popular vote plan, I think, are even greater today than they were a year ago because of the way in which we saw state legislatures in a number of states after the 2020 election start asserting authority to disregard their own state's popular vote. And perhaps more importantly, the way in which we saw many campaign representatives and party representatives and leaders claiming that what another state had done was not reliable, right? We saw litigation, we saw attorneys general from a number of states take part in litigation, claiming that some other state, I mean, I think it was the Pennsylvania election, was not reliable. This is a fundamentally changed atmosphere than the atmosphere we were in when the National Popular Vote Plan was developing 15 years ago. Then the idea was, yes, each state runs its own election, and those elections are reliable, and we can take the results of each state and add them up and figure out what the national popular vote is. And then if there are enough states that want to use this national popular vote compact, we'll take that national popular vote total and use it to determine which slate of electors those states in the compact will appoint. But in an era when states are claiming that other states don't have reliable election processes, that we can't trust the Georgia announced results anymore, I don't know how a national popular vote compact is going to work. It's difficult.
Yeah, I think it'd be very tricky. I mean, didn't Arizona try to, one of the states tried to say that, well, in Georgia too, that they could overturn the will of the people, basically.
Well, there were people making noises like that, and it's not
Yeah.
really clear that there's a complicated statutory scheme here too at play, and it's called the Electoral Count Act. And the Electoral Count Act was a response to the contested Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, which was this bitter fight that lasted until days before Inauguration Day and involved a real contest in Congress about which electoral votes to count from a few states where there were competing slates of electors. The fascinating story there. And in response to that, Congress a decade later passed the Electoral Count Act that purports to bind the way in which Congress counts a given state's electoral votes, and in particular, to constrain what Congress might do if it's getting competing slates of electors. And there are provisions in the Electoral Count Act that could become problematic if a state legislature, after Election Day, then tries to change the way in which it's appointing its electors. The Electoral Count Act says that if a state has appointed electors using a process in place by the day that Congress has established for picking presidential electors, that then the state's certification of those electors is presumptively conclusive on Congress. But if a state changes what it's doing after election day, then that presumption evaporates. So it was never really clear that states could, in fact, override their popular election after election day, even though some people were arguing they could. You know, and the argument went, the legislature has a responsibility to make sure the state is represented in the electoral college process. And if our state legislature concludes that our state's election is not reliable, if our state legislature concludes that there is sufficient evidence that fraud occurred in our election, that we cannot trust the results of what our election officials are certifying, then we must do something else. And that means we will go ahead and appoint our own slate of electors as a legislature. Those were the arguments that, in fact, were being made in some places. They never really got that far down the road, but that was the gist of it.
We did, if you can see the chat, Professor Huefner, we'll probably take this as our last question, but Ben Sullivan put a question in the chat.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd like to think that enough public awareness at some point could lead us to abolition of the Electoral College. And there certainly is a media role there in helping the public understand the way in which the Electoral College does misfire, helping debunk some of the myths about the Electoral College. The National Popular Vote group has on its webpage a nice set of short videos that try to debunk some of the myths about a national popular vote and how it would work. And some of those same myths apply to claims that the Electoral College is still important to protect small states, for instance. You hear those kinds of arguments. So the media can play a real role in enhancing the public's understanding of these issues and ought to be playing that role. But that's not going to be enough. I mean, the reality is right now that with Congress as divided as it is, we're just not going to see bipartisan support for abolishing the Electoral College. Now, it's interesting in that podcast that we hosted a year ago with Jesse Wegman and Ned Foley, I remember Jesse Wegman saying, had the 2004 presidential election been slightly different in the way I was saying earlier today, imagine that, in fact, John Kerry had won Ohio and therefore won the presidency, even though he had lost the national popular vote. In that moment, when the Republicans had won the presidency in 2000 while losing the popular vote, and then the Democrats, in this hypothetical, had won the 2004 presidential election while losing the popular vote, that would have been a moment to see bipartisan agreement for abolishing the Electoral College. But until we get an event or a series of events like that to occur, I just think it's too high a mountain to climb to produce a constitutional amendment. Meanwhile, though, yes, please help the media, help people understand.
Okay. Got something else in the chat here.
Aren't we at the point where the minority has too much power? Well, so, I mean, and this goes to the notion that the Electoral College, even as it, or especially perhaps as it was redesigned in the 12th Amendment, really was anticipating that it would be a way to create a majority of majorities, sort of aggregating the majority views of a majority of states. And that in fact, that's not what we have. And it does mean that we have a system in which I think it's in some sense correct to say minority has disproportionate power. I mean, I think that's almost sort of a tautology of saying that we have a system in which we don't actually have a majoritarian system. We're not electing a president with the majority support of a majority of states. That means it's minority. Now,
Well,
there are other deeper problems. There are problems in terms of just what the participation levels are, the turnout, and that too means we don't really have majoritarian elections in the sense of representing the views of everybody who could vote if they don't all vote.
right, right. Well, I mean, just look at Ohio. We have, 12 Republican districts and 4 Democratic, but the state actually, if it votes 50-50, pretty much Republican Democrats. So, um, yeah.
Something
Anybody?
else that's worth just reflecting on is we make these comparisons between the Electoral College outcomes and the popular vote totals. And we talk about the times when there's been a misfiring in the sense that the Electoral College outcome hasn't matched the popular vote, the national popular vote outcome. But there's something a little artificial even about doing that, because candidates are campaigning with the system we have. They're campaigning to win the Electoral College. They're not campaigning to win the national popular vote. And if we have a system in which it's the national popular vote that matters, they will campaign differently. And we can't necessarily, therefore, know that the outcomes will be the same as the outcomes we look at when they're campaigning for the Electoral College victory. But that's also important to keep in mind when people talk about the impact of Electoral College reform on small states or on big states or on urban areas compared to rural areas. There's a lot of misinformation out there too. Fundamentally, the fundamental point here really is we no longer as a country need to be electing a president through an amalgam of independent state choices. We are one nation today, and we still aspire to be as democratic as we can be. And that ought to mean that every voter's vote for president matters just as much as every other voter's vote for president. That would mean a national popular vote or, the abolishing of the Electoral College. What we have right now, it is not the case that every voter's vote counts equally. And, the US Supreme Court back in the 60s established a principle that each voter's vote should be worth the same as every other voter's vote, with 2 exceptions. And the 2 exceptions were in voting for members of the US Senate and for voting for presidential electors. And those 2 exceptions the court had to recognize because they are baked into the Constitution. We're just stuck with those until we change the Constitution. And I will say it is even harder to reform the structural problem in the US Senate. If you think it's hard to do away with the Electoral College because you have to get 3/4 of the states to agree to an amendment, it's a non-starter to do away with the lack of a one person, one vote principle in the US Senate, because the Constitution says no state can be deprived of its representation in the Senate, its equal representation with every other state in the Senate, without that state's consent. And can you imagine Wyoming saying, yeah, go ahead and take away one of our 2 senators because we don't have as many people as California. We don't mind. They're not going to consent to the reduction of their representation in the Senate. So these are relics of the kinds of compromises that were made at the time of the founding. And in part, those do trace back to the vestiges of slavery and the way in which that institution was affecting the negotiation that occurred.
Right.
I think that was an excellent summary to end things on. Thank you, Professor Huefner, for taking the time to speak to us. This is an issue that we, as a league, have come back to again and again. It's always interesting to hear the latest takes on it. So we appreciate your time. And I will be posting this recording and sending an email out to everyone who registered so that you'll know where to access that. And I'll also dig up the YouTube video of last year's OSU Moritz forum about the Electoral College as well. Alice, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, I just wanted to thank Dr. Huefner also, or Professor Huefner again, and also just to give you a heads up, we're going to be doing some things on redistricting, and of course the league convention, which is virtual this year, is coming up in May, and so there's no lack of things to think about and hopefully act on this year. Thank you again. That was a great presentation.
It was nice to be with you all. Thanks for your questions and comments too.
Thank you. Hope everyone has
Thank
a great day.
you.